Hello, Peter Linneman here. It's May 28, 2020. Thought I'd do a briefing on just various thoughts I have as this, apparently the shutdown's coming close to an end. We begin to open up and give a few thoughts on where we are. Those of you who follow us, you know there are other things at this site that you can access. Linneman letter will be coming out on July 1. For those of you that are subscribers, we'll have more detailed as always. And for those who aren't subscribers, you can reach out to my brother Doug at dlinneman@linnemanassociates.com, and he can get you information on subscribing to Linneman letter. And I appreciate all the feedback that we've gotten from those of you who've listened to the various things we've done. It's been very helpful to understand there are others who we're sharing information with, sharing thoughts with. Nobody has the answers. And I go back to my first recording when I said that nobody knows. I think there are some things we now know, but there's still a lot we don't know. As we move from a can't do, that is, you're not legally allowed to do, a can't do world, into a world more dominated by won't do. By that I mean we as individuals are deciding what are we comfortable doing, how soon we'll be comfortable doing it, and in what ways. And that's still quite unknown. We know that there is a lot of research by some amazing places going on, both for treatments and for vaccines. But we also have to be realistic that we're unlikely to have any effective vaccine widely available for probably at least a year. Hopefully we can have some effective treatments, or at least fairly effective treatments, by the end of this year. We still don't fully know what happens as the weather gets warmer and more humid to the disease. We have some research that indicates that warmer, more humid weather, in fact, dampens the ability of the virus to live and spread rapidly. But we certainly don't know what happens next in that regard. Will it come back as the weather will it go away? If it goes away, will it come back? And if it comes back, how virulent will it come back? And those are all unknown questions. We do know a fair amount about the disease that we didn't know before. Go back 2 to 3 months, we didn't know that it largely kills those who have other comorbidity factors such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer, lung disease, obesity. It is a horrific killer of those people if they get it. On the other hand, we know that it does very little, if anything, to those that are healthy, and particularly the younger healthy people, because as we age, our immunity systems slowly deteriorate. So there is an age element as well as a morbidity factor element to this. We know that basically if you're under the age of 30, you're not at notable risk. For example, in Ohio, which is a major state in terms of population, as of, I believe, the 20th of May, there had been 4 deaths in people under the age of 30. That amounts to about 1 in 1.1 million residents in Ohio who are under the age of 30. So it's about a 1 in 1.1 1 million chance of dying based on the Ohio data if you're under 30, irrespective if you have morbidity factors. As a benchmark, I looked up the chances of being hit by lightning are about 1 in 700,000. So based at least on the Ohio data, you're 1.4 times more likely to be hit by lightning than you are to die of COVID if you're under the age of 30. Now, as you go up the age profile, that begins changing, particularly as you get over 75, and have morbidity factors. And there are a number of studies that have estimated, actually incorrectly estimated, the expected life of someone who dies, and what they've done generally is use the average life expectancy of somebody the age that died, when in fact we know from medical data those that are dying are the least healthy, or tend to be in the least healthy tail of that age group. So you can imagine every age group has a median life expectancy, but there's some people with much higher life expectancy and much lower expectancy based on their health conditions. And in fact, my friend Mike Roizen and others have built this metric real age, and many people who are 75, maybe 60 in terms of real age, and some maybe 90. It appears what's happening is that those who have a lot of morbidity factors are, and therefore very short life expectancies irrespective of COVID, are the ones being hit. So the average life expectancy of that age group is a very misleading way to think about it. It's really the life expectancy of the most ill in that age group that's the more relevant. The Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluations, IHME, you've seen a lot of their work, and a lot of their work was what originally frightened decisions in many places, not just in the US, to shut down. And they had been doing a what-if exercise. And the what-if is, what if the US had the same death rates as Sweden, which did not shut down? They were largely, though not completely, a we won't economy rather than a you can't economy. They had been saying for the last couple of months that the U.S. would have 200 to 400,000 more deaths if it had not shut down based on the Sweden data. It's interesting, by August 4th, that was their outside date. It's interesting that their most recent now says about 38,000 more deaths. That is to say, all that our shutdown has really done, at least according to their models, is about 38,000 lives will be saved in the U.S. Versus the steps Sweden took by August 4th. If you realize that based on other information, about 60% of those that are dying would have been dead in this year anyway, it says maybe some number, 15 to 20,000, is now what they're saying would die if we had done a much more relaxed shutdown than the shutdown we've done. And if you think about it, if it was 20,000 lives truly saved, that is, they weren't going to die this year anyway, if it was 20,000 lives that are going to be saved, we're going to lose at minimum $2 trillion in GDP. We've already lost about 1.6 trillion of GDP as I sit here today from the end of the first week of March, that's about 7.4% of GDP on a non-annualized basis has already been shed. So if we had 20,000 saved, as the estimate shows by the shutdown, and we lose 2 trillion in GDP as a result, that's $100 million per life. I repeat, $100 million per life. Lifetime earnings for the typical employee ranges between about $1.5 and $2.5 million. So over their entire lifetime, a worker only earns about $1.5 to $2 million. And I always like pointing out that if you're killed in action honorably serving the United States as a military personnel, we give you about $200,000. So it's a bit offensive when people say the government can't put a value on people's lives. They do it with military personnel every day. There is also, we know that New York particularly, and the area of New York was hit incredibly hard. If it was not for New York, our data would look very different in the United States. And one of the knee-jerk claims is that it has to do with density and subways and so forth. But if you look at the experience of Seoul and Mexico City and Tokyo and Shanghai and Mumbai, all in different countries, all extremely dense, far more dense than New York, and all have had very little in the way of deaths. Everybody has had deaths, but very little. So it's not just density. Obviously, density increases the chances of the disease being transferred. Unfortunately, appears to be about two factors. One is the United States has a relatively unhealthy portion of the population in terms of obesity, heart disease, lung disease, high blood pressure, etc. And this has been known for a long time. And as I said, this disease is just terrible if you have those conditions. And so it's not surprising that, for example, New York, which has a much higher proportion of the population unhealthy than Tokyo, has a much higher fatality rate associated with this. It also reflects a very sad decision made in New York, a little bit also in Pennsylvania, of systematically moving COVID victims into nursing homes. And this was obviously done with the best intentions of trying to get treatment for those COVID people and to free up hospital beds for those who were requiring more serious COVID care. But they went out, they were by governmental order put in nursing homes, and the disease ravaged the nursing home sickest population, particularly in New York. It hit it everywhere if there was exposure. But what makes the New York instance, and as I say a bit the Pennsylvania instance, so tragic is that they actually took the disease to the most vulnerable population. And if you think about that, it's not surprising, therefore, that the death rates would be massively higher and the deaths would be massively higher. Where are we at economically? As I said, we've lost about 1.6 trillion. That's about my estimate, but it seems about right. 7.4% of GDP so far. The unemployed is been confusing for people because they hear the unemployment data or they hear the data on the number of jobs lost. That data is lagging and for unintentional reasons has some sample related issues. that are not normally an issue, but given how concentrated the jobs loss here are, it under picks up where the jobs are being lost. It's not anybody's phoning up the data. It's just that a random sample does not always give the full insight you need. So here's how I get to the number of unemployed as we sit here literally today. We started with, I'm going to round everything, about 5 million unemployed. We've had 41 million apply for unemployment benefits in the intervening time period. That ended last Friday. From last Friday to today, which is Thursday afternoon, an additional 2 million have been rendered unemployed. So that would get you 5 plus 41 plus 2, that's 48 million unemployed. Against that, perhaps 2 million have been hired by Walmart and Amazon and others. We don't know that exact number, but that would leave you with about 46 million unemployed, which would be a 28% unemployment rate. And so I think it's fair to say we're well in excess of 25% unemployment right now. This is the highest level of unemployment in the U.S. history. And it's interesting that just as the Great Depression was a recession turned into a disaster by horrific policy decisions. In that case, it was largely the Federal Reserve massively shrinking the money supply that turned a recession into a massive liquidity situation that created the Great Depression, the collapse of the banking system, etc. And it was the recession just turbocharged by terrible policy decisions then. I think it's similar here. We would have had a recession related to COVID. You're seeing it in Sweden. And it's that even if I can do everything I want to do, doesn't mean I will do everything. And that's it would have been a can-do kind of recession. Probably we would have lost 8 million, 10 million jobs. We certainly wouldn't have lost 40 million and plus jobs, but we would have lost 8 or 10 million jobs in short order, and we would have seen GDP probably fall 2, 3, 4% as people chose not to travel, as people chose not to go to movies, as people chose not to go to sporting events, or as sporting events chose to shut down even though they were legally allowed to operate. All of that means that we would have had a recession that was turned into what will amount to be a greater depression than we've ever had by bad policy decisions. And just as the Fed during the Great Depression was not intentionally trying to create a Great Depression, the policy decisions that have been made in the US and in most other countries across the world to shut down were not intended to create a depression. They've created the greatest depression in world history. Only governments have a footprint large enough to create such fallout. Individuals could never, even in their wildest dream, create such a shutdown. People ask, what leads us out as different parts of the economy open up? I'm still in Philadelphia. We are still shut down completely, no change. But hopefully soon there'll start to be some changes. What I think leads us out is healthcare. We eliminated elective healthcare and went to an emergency-only, basically healthcare system. That caused the healthcare system to bleed money and caused layoffs in a sector that's really never had layoffs. even during the Great Recession of 2009, that sector added jobs. So here's a sector that was adding jobs that was suddenly firing millions of people. And yes, they weren't firing as many as were being fired at hotels. It was a sector that normally was a source of jobs that became a shedder of jobs. And as we open up, I think you're going to see elective procedures come back quite quickly, seeing doctors in the regular way come back quite quickly, because we want to do that. Anybody who's had a hip replaced knows you want to get hip replacement. I've had 2. I'd be in there the day they opened up if I could, and same for knees. I've had cataract surgery. I'd be in there the day they allow me to be in there. It's life-changing. And you can go through many of these. We have not had people getting cancer screenings. We haven't had them having their hearts checked. And so I think that sector, which is a huge part of our economy, and is about 70% of all typical medical that occurs in this country, is occurring related to those people that we mention with these high morbidity factors. 70% or more of all the spending in our medical system is occurring with the treatment of people with lung problems, obesity problems, diabetes problems, heart, etc. So that will come roaring back. As those people are brought back to work to serve those people, you'll see them buying lunch, you'll see them buying clothes, you'll see them buying cars, and that will begin the knock-on. So I think that's the sector that first will recover strongest. I heard that, I think was Cleveland Clinic, after 2 weeks was up to 85% of normal elective surgeries. And that was a week or so ago. So I would imagine they're 95%. And so it underscores what I'm saying, and I think you'll see that across the country. Other sectors will come more slowly because you just don't know about restaurants. Okay, I can open, but I can't have people in it to speak of. How does that work? Or I can only have a quarter of the number of people. How does that work economically? All those questions are still being determined. I do think travel domestically will pick up both by auto and by plane far quicker than people think. And if you ask me, by the time we get to Thanksgiving, I don't think we'll have 100% recovery of travel domestically, but I can easily see us being up in the 85 to 90% of normal by then. International will come more slowly because governments are much more involved about who's allowed in. If you leave, are you allowed back in? What do you have to do when you come in? So international travel will be much slower. Therefore, hotels, for example, that depend on international travel are going to recover much more slowly than places that depend on domestic travel. Business travel is going to slowly return. I think another month or two it'll be quite slow, and then it'll pick up steam in a way similar to the way it picked up steam after 9/11. Namely, nobody was going to travel, but given time, they did. And yes, audio conference calls are productive for some things, and Zoom is productive for some things, though if I never do another Zoom call in my life, it'll be good. I find them very stressful. There's research showing they're very stressful. Our brain doesn't quite know how to process a Zoom call. It knows how to process an audio, but it doesn't know how to process the video part. We're social animals. I don't think we're going to stop being social animals. I think that it will just take some time. As I predicted, the banks are showing amazing forbearance. They have a stunning level of reserves. The banks are being very cooperative with most borrowers. The bankruptcies that you're seeing tend to be more related to people with bonds other kinds of securitized debt, because that's much harder to negotiate with than it is talking with a loan officer. No fun talking with a loan officer, but the banks have amazing excess capital in the form of reserves at the Fed. They know they're going to get more from the Fed that way. They probably don't have enough Tier 1 capital, but the Fed will allow them to go lower in exchange for no dividends, no buybacks, maybe some limitations on large bonuses for the very top people. But they will make sure the banks can forbear. This will be unique. And therefore, buying opportunities on bank foreclosures and the usual cascading of property values, when the regulators force the banks to foreclose, the banks then quickly get rid of property. That sets a very low distress mark, that sets low marks on other properties coming due, and the cascading of that, I just don't think is going to happen this time. Will there be opportunities? Yes, there's going to be opportunities where the bank may not be willing to put in additional capital for good news, like lease up or repositioning or a project that's not quite finished. And there will be room in private equity to come in and to work in those situations. There's plenty of private equity money in real estate and non-real estate to deal with those kind of opportunities. There seems to be debt available. It's cheap in terms of the base rate, expensive in terms of spread, but even during this, people have been able to float bonds. So the capital markets are kind of functioning. People ask about the stock market, which is not off a lot at this point from its peak. And my description is, one, I never understand the stock market, but I know what it's trying to do. And what it's saying is we had this enormous swing from greed to fear in March. And if you think of a discounted cash flow model, that just meant the discount rate skyrocketed as greed turned to fear. You had near-term cash flow expectations plunge because of the shutdown. And when the discount rate skyrocketed and near-term cash flows plunged, a low discount rate means all that matters is the near term, and the long time from now future doesn't matter at all. So that even though people think the long-term future recovers, it doesn't matter in the face of absolute fear. I think you saw by the end of March, the absolute fear receded. People became fearful, but not absolute fear, which is to say the discount rate reverted a bit, not back to greed, but reverted a bit. And in doing so, it said those future cash flows, not just 2020, 2021, 2022, those future cash flows matter a lot more at a lower discount rate. I think that process will continue. There'll be a lot of bumpiness. The day that we get a vaccine or a very good cure will be the day that greed returns, in my guessing. I think you'll have a record day when that occurs. And whether it's rational or not, it will be very real. In addition, I think what the market is saying is the Fed's put in almost 20% additional liquidity in the form of M1, and on top of that has put in trillions to the banking system and will put in more. And the federal government through the Treasury has put in trillions. And that all that money in the near term causes no inflation, because with the collapse of demand, we have excess supply for everything. Another way of thinking about it, having a lot more money in the system does not push up room rates right now in hotels because people aren't going. The enormous excess supply. So in the near term, it's not inflationary. It's more about liquidity and activity. As a recovery occurs, I think you do start seeing price pressures, and I think what the market is saying is those price pressures will show up in higher nominal earnings as you get out a few years from now, and it will show up in higher asset prices in general, and particularly as greed returns. And the market is about the future, not about the present. And I think that is what's going on. It will be bumpy. There'll be days when a market like this gets very fearful, and there'll be days when it gets kind of buoyant. On the real estate side, there basically are very few private transactions occurring, so it's very hard to know what private prices are. If you look at the REITs at this point, they're still off quite notably because people do not have faith in what's going to happen there yet, because it's too soon to see how many tenants will adjust in any way, good or bad. So you're still in the shutdown part. You don't have enough clarity on their cash flows, and people still are assigning very high discount rates in the terminology I was using, and very bad next couple of years by and large. Values on Wall Street are down 15 to 30%. I think those are oversold. I think when things open back up, you'll find that as economic activity picks up, real estate demand will pick up, and you'll see very kind of robust recoveries, some sectors more than others. So for example, apartments will recover as jobs come back. The biggest problem for apartments in the near term is that if you have a 28% unemployment rate, a lot of people may move back in with mom when their lease is up. And that's going to be a challenge for demand. So it's hard for apartments to do well in a 28% unemployment economy. You're not seeing it so much now because the leases haven't rolled, but every day a lease rolls for an unemployed person, that becomes a challenge. On the office side, there are two questions. Will anybody ever do anything except work from home? The answer to that is clearly yes. Surveys of workers say they want to be back. Surveys of employers say they need people back. You get some of this silly talk. I always like it when an executive is quoted as saying on CNBC or something that everything is going great working from home and we don't know that we're going to need offices again. What else are they supposed to say? Are they supposed to say it's a disaster? I have no idea what my workforce is doing at home. I have no idea of how productive they are. It's a mess. Dear investors, it's an absolute mess. Of course they have to say it's all going terrific, and in fact we may not go back. They have to put on that brave face. They talk their book. When they come back, they are going to come back to their offices. They're not going to go running to the suburbs for one simple reason. Most of them have leases in place where they're at. And the changes that will occur can only occur as leases expire. Office will find that the reduced demand due to unemployment is probably going to be mostly offset by modern low square footage per worker workspace having to be retrofitted over the next year or two to deal with the modern spacing and sanitation requirements. So hot seating and butcher block desks are a thing of the past, and they're going to need more space. And so what happens to all that WeWork space and shared workspace? My guess is whether it's done by WeWorks or the shared space operator or the landlord who gets it back, a lot of that space is going to be taken up by tenants in existing buildings having to expand their footprint to deal with more footage per worker. And in fact, this will be the end of the downward drift in square feet per worker for office. If you go to industrial, I think, again, it's hard to have a robust industrial sector in an economy with 28% unemployment. because with 28% unemployment, there's lower confidence, less income, people are purchasing less, fewer boxes, fewer things. That means that, yes, some areas of the space will do fine, but it is hard to do well if the unemployment rate is that high. So I think the whole sector, kind of like apartments, will feel weakening. And obviously, if you have an Amazon on the lease or a Walmart on the lease, you're in good shape. But not everybody has that. I think areas around ports and airports will suffer dramatically because imports and exports are plunging and will continue to plunge. Whenever incomes here and abroad fall, you get more reduction in imports and exports. That's happening already, and that's just less throughput in those nodes. But longer term, it'll hold up fine, but not until you get more people back to work, better recovery. Retail, it's interesting. The mantra is everything's going to be online, online, online. And there's no doubt that a lot of retailers, especially small businesses, have gone under, or those with bonds are going under, or already weak businesses are going under. The only comments I would make about retail is every time a weak retailer goes under, it is true that they empty space in a center, but it also means that the bulk of those sales will be transferred not to online, but to another stronger retailer. And that's been history. That's been demonstrated during this time in that, yes, online sales went up dramatically as a percent of their sales, but they really didn't capture that much of brick sales. That is to say, most of the sales that traditionally occurred through bricks that was not allowed to occur did not occur. And you think about that, online couldn't take the bulk of those sales away from brick, even when brick couldn't compete. It underscores not the weakness of online, it underscores the importance of brick. And the good bricks will become ultimately stronger as more weak bricks go out of business because they'll grab the bulk of those sales. The other challenges of online were shown during the downturn. Processing was sloppy. Grocery proved that it cannot function online effectively, much less profitably. And you also have the phenomena that I've said for years, that online retail does not make money. And a couple of examples are, go back and look at Wayfair's results, go back and look at Amazon's results. They both report huge increases in sales due to their online activities. And they both, in Amazon's case, they report reduced earnings. And in the case of Wayfair, they announced bigger losses. Namely, they weren't making money to start with. They had a record quarter, and they lost even more money. And Amazon, in spite of the cloud and tremendous handling online, they went down in earnings as they sold more. That tells you about the viability of profitability in online. It is just not there for most items, and certainly not for grocery. Hotels are going to be slow. I think the hotels that will do best are the ones that are going to do weddings, anniversary parties. Not huge, but a wedding or an anniversary party. You can imagine a family and friends figuring out how to social distance. Those that cater to those within drive distance of major population centers will do well. Everybody's itching to get out, but drive to much more than fly to. But even Vegas will start coming back, even Disney will start coming back. And unless you start seeing huge numbers of people dying as they open up in Vegas and Disney, it will psychologically feed itself. Where do I think we are? June 1, 2021. I'll repeat, I don't know. There's no statistical model that can help because we're so far outside the range of statistics that have ever existed that it's just kind of a nonsense exercise. Having said that, this is the art rather than the science, but I want you to understand that. If we are at 46 million unemployed today, my guess is June 1, 2021, we're 18 to 20 million unemployed. There'll still be a lot of won't do activity, probably related to entertainment, probably related to the large conventions, the sporting attendance, international travel, etc. So I think we probably be around 18 to 20 million. By the way, that says that we would add some number like 28 million jobs over the next 12 months. And yet we would still have an unemployment rate running in the 12 to 15% rate. Remember 2009, the highest unemployment we had was 10.3%. So I guess what I see is an amazing recovery of the easiest parts of our economy to come back, starting in healthcare, picking up steam the longer we go, getting back to maybe 18 million unemployed a year hence, and then taking 2 more years from there to get back down to a number like 8 million unemployed, something of that nature, because the last bits will be the hardest because there'll have to be new companies to take their place of the companies that ended. Some of you may remember I said that some businesses were going to close and never open again, and so there's no one to hire people back. I found out on Saturday my hair salon that I've used for 37 years, the 2 owners who are probably about 65 and 72 or so, decided to throw in the towel. They I'm sure had been talking about should we retire anyway for some time, and they've decided to throw in the towel. Why does that matter? That matters because there were 4 or 5 employees who have nobody to go back to. Whereas if they opened, they had some place to go back to. They'll eventually find something, but it just slows things down. Last point is, people say, how do we pay for all these government programs? And the answer is, we'll borrow it. And at today's very low interest rates, it will cost somewhere around 100 to 120 billion a year in additional federal debt service to pay for all this on an annual basis. We can do that for 30 years. We'll pass it on to future generations and say to future generations, you were able to help your parents and grandparents out during the greatest depression in U.S. history. And just as I wish I could have helped my parents and grandparents out during the Great Depression, I think they'll be willing to do that and take that burden. $100 billion sounds like a lot, but on a federal government that already had a budget in excess of $4 trillion, it's really rounding error. I don't mean to minimize it, but it sort of is rounding error. Of course, we can afford it. Going forward, over a 30-year period, the economy will grow. People 30 years from now, in all likelihood, will be somewhere between 30 and 50% better off than we are today, and can obviously pay for it in the same way we could pay for the World War II debt that's passed onward over time, far more easily than if we'd have made it be paid for during the war. So the same thing is happening here. I normally am not a fan of government spending programs, but this is a rare situation of ameliorating the pain and suffering of a generation that was created by a bad disease and horrible policy decisions that were associated with it. I think we are getting our money's worth in the sense of helping a generation suffer less pain and suffering. Will it be perfectly spent? Of course not. There'll be waste, fraud, abuse, political spending, etc. Having said that, all things considered, it's not bad. It's not Keynesian or otherwise. It is simply a matter of, are we getting our money's worth? And this is one of those rare instances where I suspect we are. Having said that, the interest rates are so low on our debt that we can do this with very little need to tax or cut normal spending. Doesn't mean we can continue spending crazy beyond all this, but that again is a matter, are we getting our money's worth on what we're spending? So I would end on a final note saying, historically, betting against the U.S. economy has been a bad bet over any long term. It can be a good bet in the short term, but a very bad bet in the long term, and I think that will hold true going forward. I would remind you that what started out as a virus has morphed into political, and I just try to ignore all the political noise and focus on the facts as best I can get them. I hope this has been helpful. We appreciate your interest. Again, Linneman letter comes out in about a month. If you're a subscriber, we'll do our best. If you're not a subscriber, feel free to reach out to my brother Doug at dlinneman@linnemanassociates.com. I hope you have a great day. I hope the opening up goes wonderful and safely for all of you. Thank you.